All right, in this section we are actually going to look at the different anatomical direction terms that we use in order to understand where things are in the body. So, why are these landmarks so important, and why do we care, and why do we need to learn them? Well, if you think about it, in terms of humans, none of our organ systems actually can be seen directly from the surface of the body. So when we're describing different locations of things, we have to be able to describe the position of the organs relative to each other in a way that everyone can understand. So this is kind of the language of anatomy and physiology in terms of the location of certain organs. Now, the first landmark that we want to talk about is a position called anatomical position. This is the standard position used for describing the relationship among body parts. So in other words, when you start describing the locations, you need to have the actual body in anatomical position. And that is with the hands at the sides, the palms facing forward, the feet together. The head has to be level and the eyes looking straight forward. So this is kind of what it looks like from both the front and the back. So that would be anatomical position. Now, we do have a couple of variations on this. The first one would be supine, and supine is when you lay in anatomical position face up. So like, for instance, when you lay down in bed, you're usually supine. The other one is prone, and prone is when you lay in anatomical position face down. So I know, for instance, if anybody has ever done any sort of marksmanship qualifying, one of the positions is prone, where you're actually laying on your belly and operating the weapon that way. Now, the directions themselves, once we're in anatomical position, are actually, they're nice to learn simply because many of them do exist as opposites. So we have for instance, superior and inferior are opposites of each other. Others of them are synonyms and can be used interchangeably. Now, this is specifically, and what we will be working with is specifically for humans. These synonyms do not work on things like dogs and cats because they are oriented differently in anatomical position. But for instance, anterior and ventral can be used interchangeably. And so unless it's a specific name in terms of, a specific name of something that uses either anterior or ventral, you can go ahead and interchange those. Now, left and right do exist in anatomy, but you have to be careful. Left and right refers to the left and right of the subject and not of the observer. And that actually can be a little tricky because that's what actually leads to some of the lawsuits that we've been seeing, because people in the medical profession sometimes forget that left and right do not refer to their left and right, and that is problematic. In addition, there's two other very important terms. When we describe things as parallel, you know this from math class, but parallel means it runs along the long axis of the body. And the long axis of the body is the one that goes from your forehead down in between your eyes, splits your nose in half, and it continues on that line all the way down to the floor. So anything that is parallel runs parallel to that axis. Perpendicular is at the right angle to that axis. So like your belt, it would be perpendicular to that. So let's start going through the terms and filling in your table in terms of what they mean. Okay, anterior is the first one, and it means in front or before. Its opposite is ventral. Its synonym is ventral. Okay, and that is on the belly side. So the anterior side of humans is the same as the ventral side, and that would be on the belly side of us. Now, the directional term that is opposite of anterior is posterior, and that is back or behind. So, for instance, my heel is posterior to my toes. The synonym for posterior in humans is dorsal, which you're probably familiar with like sharks and dolphins, and that means along the back side. So, for instance, our spine runs along the dorsal side of our bodies. Cranial means at the head end, and it is very similar to superior. It's not the same. It's not exactly a synonym, but superior means above or at a higher level. So for instance, my belly button is superior to my knee. It's above it. Okay, but the cranial portion of me is actually on my head. So you have to be a little bit careful there. Caudal means towards the tail end. Okay, so that would be sticking out of our backside, because we did used to have tails during our development that disappeared. All of us. Inferior is kind of its synonym. It is the opposite of superior, and that means below or at a lower level. So for instance, my foot is inferior to my knee. Medial means towards the body's long axis, so towards the center part of the body. And lateral means away from the long axis, so towards the sides. The next two actually deal mostly with our appendages. Proximal refers to towards the attached end. So for instance, if you look at your arm, the attached end would be at your shoulder. So things that are closer to that attached end are proximal. And the opposite of that is distal, which means away from the attached end. So your fingers are distal to your elbow, but your shoulder is proximal to your elbow. The last two, superficial, sorry, that's kind of split, means close to the surface, and then deep refers to far from the surface. So, for instance, your skin is superficial, but your heart is deep compared to the surface of your skin. Now, in addition to these directional terms, which we will get some more practice using, typically we also talk about sectioning the body. And when we section the body, we're referring to sectional anatomy. Basically, this is a way of slicing a body that allows us to look at the internal organization and structures. And how we take the slice determines its name. This is extremely important for imaging techniques like MRIs and CAT scans, because you can, with these pieces of equipment, you can slice the body in different ways. We have 3 sections or 3 planes along which we can actually divide the body. We're going to go through them verbally, and then I will actually show you them on some diagrams. The transverse plane runs perpendicular to the long axis of the body. And when we take a slice transversely, we usually refer to this as a cross-section. When we take a cross-sectional slice out, it's going to divide the body into a superior portion that's left behind and an inferior portion that's left behind. If you think about it, we take a cross-sectional slice out. It's supposed to be very, very thin. Okay, we have to take it out, and then we have to orient it. We orient it so that the subject is supine, so laying with their face up, with the observers looking towards the subject's head. Okay, and that is very, very important, because you have to orient it correctly in order to read what's going on correctly. So let me do a quick demonstration here, if I can get this to work. Okay. Let me get an ink color that you can actually see. There we go. All right, so let's say that we have a person like this. I know my stick figure drawings are awesome, aren't they? Now, we're going to take a transverse slice, which goes this way. So basically what we would do is we would slice it, and then we would pull that out. All right, and then what we would do is we would actually orient it. Okay, so we have the slice and we lay it down on the table. All right, so this would be their left side. This would be their right side. Their head would be facing up, and their feet would actually be sticking out of the screen towards you. Okay, so this is their back, okay, laying down, and their head would be going back into the screen that way. Okay, so that's how you orient a cross section or a transverse section. Now, another type of plane is the frontal plane. The frontal plane runs along the long axis of the body, and it extends out to include all of the appendages. So basically this would be like if you took a slice and you went across, started at one ear, went up and over like a headband to your other ear, and then continued that slice all the way down the body. It divides the body into anterior and posterior sections. So you have a front half and a back half. The last one is the sagittal plane. It also runs along the long axis of the body, and it divides the body into a left section and a right section. Alright, so the long axis is going to come out between your eyes and back to your head and slice down that way. Okay. Sometimes we only do a mid-sagittal section simply because when you run along that part of the long axis, you don't divide the legs in half. So the mid-sagittal section is on the same plane, but it kind of stops at the waist after you've cut through the trunk of the body. Okay, so what we want to do here is actually go through these diagrams in your note packet and label them. So this first one incorporates most of the directional terms that we actually looked at. Alright, so in letter A, up here, this is actually superior. Oops. There we go. And on my version, you can see that it's in color, so down below her feet would be inferior. And that actually holds true on the second diagram as well. Alright, let's deal with these orange boxes next. This is the front side of the body, or the anterior portion. Another name for that would be ventral, because we are on the belly side. So the opposites of this would be posterior or dorsal. The blue ones here, you can see we're at the head end, so this would be cranial. And the opposite of cranial here, this would, if we had a tail, that's where that would be, so that is caudal. Now, over in diagram B, we're going to deal with the little purple boxes here first. If I move towards the belly button, that is medial. And if I move away from the center there, that is lateral. Now, the two boxes, the two bluish colored boxes here are actually the same. This end up here is the attached end, and that is not. So this one here is proximal, and the bottom one is distal. Same thing here, attaching at the hip is proximal, and the far one is distal at our toes. Now, the other diagram has to do with the planes that we can slice along. So let's take a look at that. Okay. Again, mine are in color, so it does make it a little bit easier. But you can see with this one here, when I slice along this line, okay, that plane, this would be the slice that I would remove if that was actually taken out. Okay. So that slice is our frontal. Now, this one here, we are slicing her down in between her eyes and her nose, and we end up with this section, and that is our sagittal section. And then the green one that's here runs perpendicular to that long axis, and this would be the section. Remember, her head is facing up, this is her back, this is her left, this is her right, her feet are sticking out towards you. This is her transverse or her cross section. We will be actually practicing all of these anatomical terms with a lab that we have. All right?